All right, so this is going to be the tricks lecture, going through two Fs and one in C, and these encompass a lot of different tricks and stuff. So we'll go over the tricks. We'll go over the I guess what they are, what the answers are, etc. Let me see if I can screen share. All right, can you guys see my screen?
I can't. Oh yeah, I can see.
All right, great. So starting on Glenbrook's round 6 NC. So first off is truth testing. In general, the utility of truth testing is pretty varied. So what is truth testing? It's that you should vote for the debater that proves the truth or falsity of the resolution. This is in contrast to comparative worlds, which says that the judge should vote for the debater that proves the desirability of their particular world. So this could be a counterplan, a critique, the plan, the status quo, whatever. Truth testing sort of ignores all that and puts the burden on just the text of the resolution, really. So the reason this enables so many tricks is that a lot of tricks rely on semantically, on sort of semantic interpretations of the resolution. So things like a prioris are basically semantic interpretations of the resolution that say it's on face true or on face false. Similarly, paradoxes say that some concept or the resolution itself that the resolution relies on is on face false or contradictory. And then like skepticism says that there is no such thing as ought because there's no moral obligation possible, so the resolution is on face false, etc. So in general, if you disprove truth testing itself, then that really helps you with all of these like random tricks that they'll point out. Now that is to say you can't drop theory because theory is still a voter, but a lot of the like other non-theory quote unquote substantive tricks really go away. So I guess we'll just jump right into some of the warrants here. So well actually let's see, there's probably a file. Search up the file I'm opening now. I remember Coach Lawrence put it together for the Glenbrooks, and it's like pretty good at containing a lot of answers. And there are some notes that you should probably read after this, but I guess we'll just go through. There's a comparative world section here. All right, let me know when y'all have it up. All right, I'll take that as yes. So first, going over some of the justifications for truth testing, there's this inclusion argument. This first part, the A point, is more like critiquing K's of language. It says that critiques that don't relate to the resolution become more personalized and thus can be bad because they create more violence in the debate space. Answer to this is pretty simple. If there is violence, then sometimes you need to critique it, even if it's unrelated to the resolution, which sort of link turns that. Oh, and then there's also the exclusion. There's also an exclusion argument, which is other roles of the ballot will exclude certain offense. Again, you can link turn this. Truth testing arguably can exclude all counter advocacies, definitely a lot of different critiques, etc. And the arguments it does include are usually bad, like we'd impact her in their inclusion. So like a priori, skept, etc., that are either morally abhorrent or take away, I guess, focus from some of the more important issues, or from issues like topic education, etc. Isomorphism. Yeah, so this one is generally this one is not as common. I think it's more a subjectiveness argument about why you need like a clear, bright line for to determine who's winning offense. Comparative worlds is not necessarily a binary, but that's not a reason why like it can't guide action or it can't be used as an evaluative framework, because you still have to adjudicate offense even when you're right. Even if you're figuring out if something is true or false, you still have to weigh the relative merits of arguments, their impacts, etc., which is what our role of the ballot would call for too. Constitutivism. So this one is extremely common. There is this like Scoggin and Overin card that kind of responds to this pretty well. But even in the abstract, essentially what it says is it defines negate as answering as to refute the truth of something, and affirm as to prove the truth of something, and basically says because of that, truth testing makes the most sense for debate itself. So a couple of ways to approach this. First, you can answer constitutivism or jurisdiction. If you're like constitutivism is not true, you read the Schmagency objection or whatever, which is like constitutivism relies on us saying X concept is constitutive of us as debaters. The Schmagency obligation or objection is like, well, we could be Schmabaters or like Schmagents or whatever. The point is that we can change who we are even if we have the same characteristics, so that there isn't something like truth testing that is a constitutive obligation. And other jurisdiction arguments like jurisdiction is false because an empirically proven disproven by chaos, whatever. The other argument is this can be important, especially if they read like a prioris. Those will also probably define affirm or negate, and they'll have different definitions, and you should point out the contradiction. And you can also read counter definitions. Again, the Scoggin and Overin card that is like somewhere should be on the drive for sure. Helps like consolidate that all pretty well. The bindingness argument, this one is like not really. This one is like a really bad collapse argument. So it's like you have to use truth or falsity to answer truth testing, which proves truth or falsity matter. The point here is that truth testing is about proving the truth or falsity of the resolution. We're not saying that the ideas of truth and falsity do not matter at all. Rather, it's a question of whether the resolution should be the focus point here. And our argument here, and so this does not, neither of these points prove a collapse argument, because they're about proving the truth of or falsity of something else, i.e. of a roll of the ballot, of some different conditional, whatever. But none of those are responsive or reasons for why we should evaluate the truth or falsity of the resolution specifically. So that was obviously a bit of time. In a real debate, you obviously wouldn't answer their position. You'd be a little more efficient. But if you prove sort of conclusively that you should use comparative worlds, or you answer truth testing, then they can't go for a lot of their tricks, a lot of their blippy tricks offense. Think of it as like a sort of I guess like a stopping point where you don't have to deal with any of their blippiness, relatively so. For the regular comparative worlds claims, these are pretty straightforward. Prevents infinitely tricky 1Cs because it doesn't allow for infinite nibs, a priori, scap, whatever. Real world, since comparative worlds is evaluating who does the better debating in the context of proving the desirability of a specific world, it forces judgments to be more real world rather than abstract in terms of debating semantically about the resolution. Topic education is similarly about that. I think topic education is relatively strong. Advocacy, yeah, it forces them to defend alternative worlds themselves. Inclusion, again, this is like a link turn to the argument we talked about above. This collapse argument is kind of silly. Yeah, this seventh point is really just the argument we were saying as a response to their bindingness argument. And then the constitutivism answer, these are both great answers to constitutivism and jurisdiction. Definitely would recommend reading this because they always have that justification. And they'll often use it as a reason for why it transcends theory, because constitutivism isn't necessarily, although it actually kind of is, based on ideas of fairness or education. And so they could couple this with like theory isn't a voter as a reason to exclude all of your offense for comparative worlds. This is why it went for against me in St. Mark's octos. And so it's important to be cognizant of the different tricks they might go with that. All right, next, permissibility and presumption. So what are permissibility and presumption? Presumption is a state in when there is no offensive reason to vote for either side. And so the question is, in that instance, who do you vote for? The default view is that you should vote negative if there is no negative advocacy, because the app has the burden of proof, and if they've not met that burden of proof, you should vote for the neg. If the neg does read an advocacy, then generally the burden of proof would flip, which is why you might presume F. People will make arguments based on time skew, based on flawed logical arguments as a reason why you should presume F or neg, and you can respond to either of those. Second is the idea of permissibility. So it's the idea that when you say, like, someone ought to do something, like I ought to pick up my mouse, you can interpret it through some different lenses. If you think I ought to do something, then that's like a moral obligation. I have an obligation to pick up my mouse. If you think I ought not do something, then that's the opposite, right? That is called like a prohibition or a moral prohibition against doing something. And then what lies in between is the idea of moral permissibility. You neither have an obligation nor a prohibition against doing something. And so the question is, well, if that happens, does it go negative? Does it go affirmative, etc.? And so here the permissibility negates argument is that since you have to prove the resolution true, i.e. you have to prove you ought to do something, an act of obligation, that states should remove their nukes or whatever. If you haven't met that burden, then, and all acts are merely permissible, then that's a reason for you to vote negative. So what is the reason for them doing this? This 1 and C is pretty explicit in having, in saying that moral skepticism is true, although I guess we'll get to skept triggers later. But the idea of moral skepticism is that you cannot level moral judgments. There is no such thing as objective morality. And essentially what that means in the context of debate is that when the resolution says you ought to do something, that will always be false, because an ought statement is a statement of moral obligation, but if skepticism is true, there is no such thing as moral obligation. So if permissibility negates, if presumption negates, skepticism would trigger those, and you would automatically vote negative. And then they have some reasons that we'll get into for why skepticism is true. Sometimes they will not be as open about this. They might have certain, like, I guess, flags or arguments for why if you refute a part of their framework, then no other framework could be true, which is a reason why moral skepticism happens. And those are generally called skept triggers. So it's really important to use cross-ex to figure out what they're reading. And this goes for anything, not just skept triggers, but a prioris, what have you. In responding to permissibility and presumption negates, there are arguments for both sides here. You might want to just disprove skepticism itself. You can say read an external disad to voting on presumption, which is like permissibility and presumption, and even skepticism itself all rely on this notion that everything is allowed, or you can never condemn anything, which allows for like the most atrocious acts, so like genocide, rape, what have you, that should be condemned. And so in order to do that, you should reject the logic of evaluating permissibility, skepticism, whatever. And that would be like a disad to, or an answer to the framework of skepticism. This Russell argument, this is not as common. This, again, does not, it's sort of strange logic here, right? The argument as it goes is that there are two possible outcomes, something being true or something not being true. However, if we said something is true and we said, but they're not actually true, then neither happens. So this is like a very localized example. It can't really be applied to the resolution writ large, because like it simply lacks contextualization for what it means to like disprove a part of the resolution to disprove it entirely. In general, you should answer all of these takeouts because they probably do take out the resolution under the conception of truth testing, which is why it's important either to focus on truth testing or to answer each skepticism warrant. So first, this first argument, Wittgenstein, it's like propositions are good. Yeah, so it's like everyone is moving. Yeah, so it's trying to disprove an idea of there being one unified like idea of a moral good. And so it's saying everyone's trying to do good things, but we still disagree on certain things. And because of that, there's no chance that there is any actual instance of the good. The flaw here is saying that everyone strives towards the good, right? Because clearly that's not true. Clearly people have different moral theories, but those aren't necessarily true. Which is why it doesn't necessarily prove there's no objective morality. It just means that they're necessarily wrong. The paradox of induction. This is also a common Phil argument. I would recommend looking at the past video on Phil and util, but we generally have answers for why like induction is not necessarily, why the problem of induction has no impact on sort of evaluating empiricism. And I would look through some Mark-Phil blocks on that. This argument, you have to know everything about a situation and act on it. That's not true. You don't need to know everything about a situation to act immediately in the face of injustice. It's empirically disproven because we make moral beliefs all the time with uncertainty. And even then, there's no reason why the information we have is not already sufficient. Plus, if you think that we need to know everything about a situation to make a decision, then that would mean it's impossible to even vote in the round because the judge does not have complete information about everything. The McIntyre argument, each individual has to adopt his or her first principles. Yeah, so this is like, the idea is like, ethics is ultimately relies on like subjective first principles, not fundamental first principles. However, if you prove something like util, that it relies on like fundamental and somewhat objective elements, like pleasure being intrinsically good, pain being intrinsically bad, etc., then it would disprove that. And also, this is sort of a vague argument that isn't really contextualized. So obviously, all of this is pretty long, but some grouping here would especially help because, for example, on util, they would probably make similar Chalcondytes claims, and you can cross-apply the induction answers. Or using cross-ex to, especially when they spam you with a lot of like sort of silly arguments, you can use cross-ex to sort of expose the faulty logic behind that. Neeblety, not going to that. And then the rest of this is like philosophy stuff. Yeah. So truth testing, that one's pretty common, so we're not going to have to go through it again in the other NCs, and then a lot of skepticism stuff. Moving on to the GCBF, this is the St. Mark's Octos round. I won't go through the framework itself. It's just a philosophy that says that we ought to default to the status quo because it's what God wills. This is like a very large 1NC, obviously, or 1AC underview. And so something good to do in these instances is to at the top have reasons for why you get new responses to like blips in the in the 2NR, because, and the justification for this is that you don't know the implication of the blip till the 1AR when they actually explain the impact and why it's dropped the beta, etc. The Shah card, it's written by a debater, but also this is just an Affleck's argument about time skew, can be answered relatively simple. Paradigm theory, The general like 1 and C theory hedge is pretty good. Something that could help during these speeches is to break it up, because you can see even within this 2-point there are several different arguments that are all put together, just kind of separating them right now. Yeah. Conclusion first, treat this spikes as offensive theory arguments. Yeah, so just in this alone, you have paradigm issues, you have a reason to reject arguments that contradict the spikes, and an assertion that is Lexley prior, even though there's no warrant for that. I guess this is part of the same argument. AF theory outweighs, because A, time skew, and B, because we could collapse to anything. Answer time skew above, and then against this, that's sort of the point of negative strategies. There's no impact. Not even sure what this means. And then the last argument is a reason why if you respond to the spikes, then it's dropped the debater. So definitely important to respond to, because otherwise you lose for respond to the spikes. Simple argument is here is we have to be able to contest them to figure out what even is a good norm in the first place. No new 2NR paradigm issues. Again, since your argument is that because everything becomes new in the 1AR when they contextualize it, 2N theory arguments are the most logical. All neg-interps are counter-interps, so this argument basically says the AF is always an implicit defense of all of their arguments, of all of their practices, which means if the 1NC reads an interp indicting the 1AC, then it would be a counter-interp. And if it's a counter-interp, then for it to be dropped at debater, you have to win an RVI. These 6 words are intended to be an a priori. Affirm means status fact. If you A, doesn't really have any implications. Important to point that out. B, it conflicts with truth testing. So again, pointing out these contradictions is really important. Evaluate the debate after the 1AR. Obviously unjustified, because then the AF would always auto-win. No new 2NR framing issues. I think this just means that you can't make refutations on 2NR. Again, means that there's no actual debate, kills topic education, whatever. In Coach Lawrence's file, he has, I think, like broad responses to a lot of these different arguments. So like theory hedges, in the 1AC section, there are like responses to tricks that are like, obviously wouldn't read yes 1AR theory, but like you read fairness as a voter, education as a voter, comparative worlds, evaluate every speech in the debate, what have you. Yeah. Yes, we get 2NR responses, key to resolve strat skew, whatever. Affability to frame the round is non-unique. Yes, reciprocity, respond to 2NR arguments, and whatever. Oh yeah, this is defense, the argument you do usually read, which is like the implications aren't clear, and you just explain that, why it isn't unclear, which responds to that. If I win 1 layer, vote AF. So this would mean that if they do something like read substance and you read theory, for example, then it means that even if they win substance, it would outweigh theory. So anything the AF wins essentially has to outweigh. Obviously, skews the debate towards the affirmative in terms of allowing them to create truisms, sort of true layers, like a prioris, whatever, that would then outweigh, or stuff like that. Neg uplayering is key to negative strategy. Time skew is answered above. If you notice a trend here, it's that a lot of these are justified through time skew. Permissibility and presumption, talked about this earlier, but this time it's a reason why it affirms. Generally, the argument about burdens of proof and burdens of rejoinder are pretty good, and you can say that that matters more. That's the most logical reason for how permissibility and presumption should flip because it's about the burdens in the activity. So also we don't default assuming that something is true or false. There are morally neutral actions like drinking water, not necessarily. All actions have moral goodness or falseness. We say drinking water is morally good because it's key to live, whatever. Yeah, you can't use embedded clash. Obviously, embedded clash is important in like really blippy 1ACs like this. Accept AF interpretations since the AF speaks first. Obviously leaves no room for debate or contestation. Yeah. Here is roll of the ballot just to point out what's the same. Text, there's a constitutivism argument here like before. Logic, this is the collapse argument we went over before. Oh, there's another trick here. So this is called like conditional logic. So the theory is a little complicated, but what the implication of it is that the argument is that if you have a statement if P then Q, you can deny P, but Q could still be true. And so then they say you can read all arguments as conditionals. So for example, the ballot, so if the AF does the better debating, then I should vote AF, and you take that the statement if P then Q is true, even if you read if not P, that means that even if the AF didn't do the better debating, you should still vote negative regardless. It relies on like a terrible interpretation of logic and also relies on truth testing. You should refute the implication, which is that it's a misreading of logic because answering the antecedent does not mean the conditional is true as a whole. Just logically, because that would mean any statement can be true, which is what they're trying to leverage it as. Finally, inclusion, we went over that before. Okay. Can't read independent voters. I would, if you're reading an independent voter, then you should just contextualize it. So if you're saying like Skep is independent, reading Skep as a voter, then you should contextualize for why it's violent, whatever, why that would outweigh. And obviously a lot of these like skew arguments are non-unique and can be easily outweighed. Induction fails, we talked about that before. The neg must concede my offense so we can focus on framework debate, key to phil ed. So this is ACC AF contention choice. So you can't contest the idea that whatever this framework contention is, that the GCB would want everything to be the status quo. Again, obviously kills substantive education, etc. Theory is incoherent. This is like pretty big or pretty important. The way it can be leveraged is that if you concede, you do not want to concede theory is incoherent. If you concede that theory is incoherent, then whoever speaks last essentially wins, because it means that you can never read theory to disprove, to hedge back against certain practices, which means that whoever speaks last essentially gets to cheat last and win. It can be tempting to think, oh, if theory is incoherent, then I can just answer all this garbage and I don't have to respond. It's tempting, but ultimately it'll do you more harm. You want to respond to theory is incoherent because, as I mentioned earlier, otherwise they can use that as a reason why constitutivism, why in this case they went for an a priori, the affirm means the status fact one, plus truth testing with the constitutivism argument, said that constitutivism didn't rely on theory, and then said theory is incoherent, so the responses to the competing world's warrants do not apply. Yeah. Oh, also up here, I think there was another a priori. Never mind. So going through the arguments, the ballot always relies on inequality. Yeah, but that should be inequality of skill, not from external abuse through unfair practices. You can't evaluate theory because It's evaluating the flow instead of what's actually a better norm. Obviously, the flow determines what is a better norm because you're debating about what makes something a good norm. Theory allows the better theory debater to win. Not necessarily, it also relies on the skill, the quality of arguments, etc. Things get proven that are true. It doesn't set true norms. Theory doesn't have to rely on norms. This is also a good general framing point. Theory doesn't have to rely on norm setting. It can be about responding to abuse. So, for example, if they did something unfair, they have to merely lose for it. It's not about setting a broader norm, which means it would answer this. No competitive activity would set rules in the middle of competition. Debate is unique. It is a communicative activity. Theory sets better norms, sets bad norms because it doesn't set the best version of the interp. Something is better than nothing. If it's better than a different interp, then you should vote for it. Theory tries to limit arguments, but uses arguments to do so. Limits is referring to potential cases, not the arguments present on a flow in a debate round. Not jurisdictional. The judge can only vote for someone proving their side. No, the judge can endorse theory because they have varied. That's what the voters themselves prove. The judge has different obligations. Methodological pluralism. This is a K preempt. You don't get counter advocacies or counter plans. There's the plants argument, which is like there's no negative resolution, so you can't predict it. And then there's another argument that's like, yeah, there's no predictability for the AF. Obviously, it's silly. AFs, there's no abuse because the AF, if they have reasons why the AF is key, can resolve it, and it's key to advocacy, whatever. All right, that was a lot. Obviously, there's like, this is some of the worst of it. It has a lot of stuff that's hidden, and so it's important to use cross-examination to figure out which arguments are hidden where. As well as doing lots of broad grouping. So having broad defenses of your practices, saying what we did in general is good, they need a clear claim warrant impact, etc., what have you. And so really in these debates, because you don't have all the time to do what we just did, which is separating each part, it's important to use that sort of grouping. We had this other AF, but this is going pretty long. I guess I'll attach it as something you can go through, maybe to figure out, and ask me questions if you have any. But yeah, I guess we'll wrap it up there. Any questions? All right, I guess we'll just end it there. Thanks.